Good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's annual dinner of the Sciences Po American Foundation. Before I turn it over to Eric Schmidt, I want to give a special thanks to all of you out here tonight. With your help, we've been able to raise over $450,000, which is a new record for the school. And I would like to give a special thanks to some of our most generous donors tonight: Stephen Haimo, Slavomir Krupa, Pierre Mordac, Andrew Gondlach, Jean-François Ducrest, Paul and Cecile Horvath, and of course, my co-chairs, Ken Jacobs and Agnès Montré. Thank you for your generosity. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight my friend Eric Schmidt. Eric wears many hats: .com, of course, but also .org and even .gov. Eric launched his career as a software engineer. He was Chief Technology Officer at Sun Microsystems, CEO of Novell, and also had several research positions at Xerox PARC, Bell Labs, and others. At Google, then Alphabet, Eric helped to grow Google from a Silicon Valley startup to a global technology powerhouse. And he oversaw all of the company's technical and business strategy, first as Chief Executive Officer and then as Executive Chairman. And under his leadership, Google dramatically scaled its infrastructure, something he's going to talk about tonight, and diversified the product offering, all the while keeping a very creative and startup-like enterprise. Many of you know Eric as ambassador at large for the internet around the world. His mission is to defend the open internet. It's taken him all over the world. He has many tales to tell about his trips, in fact. You should get him to talk about his visits to Pyongyang or to Rangoon. And did I mention that he's also a pilot? So when he tells you he's flying to Tunis or Chicago, he actually means that literally. Eric's been involved in many civic endeavors. He chairs the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., and was a close advisor to President Obama on technology and science issues. As chairman of the Defense Innovation Board, Eric advises the Secretary of Defense and the Defense Department on how the military can better use artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other technological innovations. What better person than Eric to give us an outlook on how advanced computing and AI can help us with achieving breakthroughs in society today? We're only at the beginning of this adventure, and it's such an exciting thing. And what better audience with whom to think about these questions than the alumni, the friends, and the supporters of Sciences Po? The school has gone through tremendous change over the last few years, from its traditional training of French presidents, French prime ministers, and top public policymakers in France, to a renowned school training leaders all across Europe in diplomacy, the law, journalism, and more recently, business. Sciences Po has transformed over the years, just as its students, alumni, and faculty are today taking a central role in transforming the world. Many thanks to all of you once more. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. I cannot think of a better use of our time than to try to raise money for the top universities in Europe and in France. They are underfunded compared to their American counterparts, and they need the money. Thank you very much. I cannot think of a better use of what we're doing tonight. When I think about the future, I think about invention, and I think about the opportunities for new things that are coming. And I think about a model where the most exciting kind of inventions are the inventions that allow you to make new inventions. And that is what has happened most recently with AI. And what's interesting about AI is that France, and in particular Paris, have an opportunity to be great leaders here, because of the long tradition of French education, the incredible mathematics capabilities and so forth. And indeed, my company has created an AI center in Paris for precisely that reason. So in any case, when Anne and Ken, who've been friends for a very long time, said maybe I could help here, I thought, what should I talk about? And I thought I'd start by saying that I'm apparently getting an award from you all about Stanley Hoffman, at least named of him. And what's interesting is that he was one of the great thinkers about geopolitics. And we need these people more now than ever. And we need them to understand how diplomacy and interactions are going to go in the digital age. Again, I cannot think of a better way to honor him than to essentially recognize the contribution of science postgraduates going forward, not just to France, but for the globe, because so many have ultimately ended up in the United States and elsewhere. Now, when we think about the future, we tend to get confused. We think about science fiction and so forth. And so there's a Marcel Proust quote. Of course, he was also a graduate from you all in remembrance of things past. He said, "Time passes, and little by little, all that we have spoken in falsehood becomes true." And I think it's interesting that we forget that the iPhone, for example, was only 10 years old, right? That the personal computer is 30 years old. That the internet, from most of you's perspective, is 15 years old, right? That all of the things that we're talking about today in American and European politics are relatively recent inventions. We forget that these things change very quickly. So instead of treating these like fear, I'd rather have you treat them with excitement, that something new has happened, that we have a new opportunity to address old problems. And you think about it, let's use the imagine framing. Imagine that if you could use techniques from astronomy to detect cancer. Imagine if every job seeker could find a job and educational opportunity. Think of a Google Maps for jobs, for example, so that the mismatch that exists today between those two can be fixed. Imagine if we could predict the weather with such accuracy that we could pinpoint where the catastrophic events are going to happen next. So we could actually pre-plan and move the resources and so forth and not be sort of surprised at the end in a great, and why does this matter? It saves lives, right? It saves money, but most importantly, these all save lives. So I've started looking at these through an entity that I've set up called Schmidt Futures, which is essentially a philanthropic vehicle that's going to talk about people and platforms and the impact of AI, which I want to talk a bit more about. So the interesting thing is that that money and government, which is where most of the activity is, are really about people. And what I will tell you is we all understand that the reason we're so committed to higher education at the graduate level, such as at your university and elsewhere, is because we need these leadership skills. So in my case, the ability to have talented scientists as well as political leaders and so forth working together to solve these problems is profound. In the same sense, the platforms that are getting built are enormously powerful. So what's happening is that people are using computer science and data platforms to aggregate data to answer questions that you could never before. Think of it as the instrumentation of how we live, right? How do cities work? Where does the money go? If you want to take a negative example, how does the corruption work? Where are the terrorists? Where does the illicit money go? Whatever it is, the thing you care about, we can track these things with a level of precision that will help the right people solve those problems. But partnerships are also important. And what I hear over and over again is nobody's acting alone. Over and over again, I hear, I want to do something. Well, instead of saying, I want to do something, why don't you say, I and all of these other people collectively want to do something? Because that's how we're going to make progress. So in this case, think of these as market failures, for lack of a better term. This is why universities matter, because universities can instill these values in what people should be doing. So in my case, I've decided to focus on bringing talented people to the world and to identify that talent early and get it educated quickly. The time frames for education and the intensity of it are shorter now than ever. Think of the quality of the graduates, the young men and women that are coming out, and how much smarter they are now than we were. It's just true. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anybody, but it's just true, right? And by the way, their children will be smarter than they for the same reason. We can use advanced computing in various technological ways, which I'll describe, to really help systems thinking happen. Now, when you think about people, right, think about the human genome, and as a good example, it's sort of engineering and mathematics, and then ultimately the law and so forth. And the discoveries that have come from the human genome created a platform for a huge industry, which is present everywhere, and in particular in France. So I'll give you an example. I met a woman named Zhilai Zhang, and she's an Australian astronomer and astrophysicist. She uses low surface brightness optical images, radio, and UV data to study how galaxies evolved. That's pretty cool. Not exactly directly relevant to tonight's dinner. So then she thought, well, what would be interesting is, can I use the same observational techniques to study medical imaging, and in particular breast cancer? And the breast cancer situation is really bad. It's 40,000 deaths per year in the United States, and usually it's detected visually. So, and then, as you know, women undergo sort of surgery and so forth and all of that. So what she's done is she's used AI to aggressively detect breast cancer images without the invasive techniques that women have to undergo today, right? This is amazing. That's a good example of the kind of talent that I'm looking for and trying to fund. We've then supported her with a grant that went through something called Schmidt Science Fellows, which we set up with the Rhodes Trust to try to identify the top talent in the world who could be bicameral, if you will. They were moving from one field, like astrophysics, to another one, like medical imaging. To me, this is the sexiest part of everything in science. It's when you take one set of ideas and you apply it elsewhere. I'll give you another example. This is also a woman, whose name is Yuan Gong. She's a young Stanford scientist, and she works on something which I did not understand called Perscovites and quantum dots. These are nanomaterials of a particular kind. But what was interesting about this is that what she wanted to do is she wanted to go from these nanomaterials to doing something more useful. She'd grown up in very polluted China, big surprise, and so she's invented a particular kind of essentially organism which can eat parts of the pollution around her. So this may be one of those extraordinary inventions, it may not, but it shows you what you can do when you take one area, in this case it was nanomaterials, and you apply it to a problem. I mean, I can go on. But what I've learned is that you have to find a way to identify these people, and the statistics, again, I'll use a US number, are terrible. The average grant to an NIH, first grant to an NIH investigator in healthcare is at the age of 43. Only 10% or go to people of the age of 35 or so forth. So here we are, as I said, we've got these people coming out who are smarter than we were at the same age, and then we deprive them of the funding and the labs and the science and the so forth to move things forward. And this is true whether it's AI tools or the other kinds of tools that I'm describing. Now, why do I mention the platforms? People and platforms. Because the platforms are incredibly powerful. Here's roughly how it works. Today, the platforms that we use in AI have better vision than humans. They can see in memory far greater than a human. So if there is a pattern, and in particular a pattern that can be detected visually, the computer can do a better job. Now, what am I talking about? What does a doctor do? What does a nurse do? What does a car do? What does a human driving a car? A lot of what they're doing is vision. And we can provide tools that emphasize and help them do their jobs better. So when you go to the ophthalmologist or the skin doctor in the future, they won't just look at you with the little microscope. They'll use a computer imager that will be far more accurate. Their job doesn't go away. They just get more accurate and you get healthier. It's clearly a good thing. The early wins are there, but I want to talk about the next win. And the next win is probably in climate change, and this is an area where people actually, at least in this room, people believe in science and climate science is correct. And the fact of the matter is, take a look at what happened with this horrific hurricane, right, in the last couple of days. Tremendous, tremendous damage around. Could that have been predicted? It turns out the climate models are not good enough. Now, this is after 40 years of hard work and special algorithms. So there is a professor at Caltech named Tapio Schneider who, working with a team which I have funded, has figured out a way to marry artificial intelligence, which is that deep parallel processing, that deep vision I talked to look at clouds and predict what will happen to clouds. And you go, well, we like clouds, but why are clouds important? It turns out clouds define much of the climate science outcomes. And so there's a hope that we'll be able to really predict these kinds of extraordinary events much ahead and improve the quality of the models. And if you read the report that occurred earlier this week, we only have a few years before we pass a point of no return with respect to the impact that we're having on climate. So the time is now, and the time is now to use these tools to approach this. I'll give you another example. This is unrelated. We have a huge refugee crisis, especially in Europe. And so there's a project at Stanford where people figured out an algorithm that would match jobs to immigrants. And we're funding that and piloting that in Europe, throughout Europe. Very interesting. Now, it's kind of obvious, right? You want to put your immigrants where there are jobs. But it's not, in fact, how they do it. And you end up in these situations where you have the mismatch of the century and all sorts of bad societal outcomes. Why does this matter? It's the use of AI to solve a political problem, right? And you sit there and you go, well, couldn't somebody help me get the people in the right place so I don't have a big political problem? And the answer is yes. And that's a very good example of it. These are all examples of systems thinking. And I'll highlight a few more and then I take your comments and questions. It seems to me that ultimately we're going to solve these problems collectively. Again, I use a United States number, and this is similar in Europe as well. From 1973 to 2013, hourly workers' compensation rose 9% and their productivity rose 74%. We have a problem. We have a problem for our middle class who are working very hard and they're not seeing the economic return to their hard work. Maybe we can figure out solutions that will both get them the jobs that they need, and again, I'm working hard on that, but also new ways of forming entrepreneurship. I funded, as a result, I funded universities in Arizona, Ohio, Utah, and Wisconsin to try a model where what you're going to do is you're going to take the local people and match them with money and entrepreneurs and see if they can build businesses there rather than on the coast. The economic drive, especially in China and the United States, is largely driven by these tech-heavy, big platform companies, which I represent. But why don't we try to find some other ones? So far, the wins seem to be in transportation, housing, utilities, and food, all of which are crucial. So to me, when I sit there and I go, what could we do? Right? Figuring out ways of getting economic security to people, giving them enough of a lifeline, is crucial. Why does this matter to people who care about politics? Because that drives politics, and I don't need to take you through that reasoning. So when I think about people, platforms, and partnerships, I see that as sort of a unifying theme. I want to take 1 minute to mention China, because China has a different model for doing this, but their activities are just as profound. China alone has more STEM graduates, a larger internet, and a recent report says that China has the second largest number of AI companies in the world, more than 1,000 companies, or 20% in the world. I was there recently. They're making long-term bets on young talent. They have plenty of risk capital. They have a historic culture of entrepreneurship, and they work incredibly hard. So not only will the Western axis, right, sort of France, Germany, UK, and the United States work this out. I should mention Canada, because a lot of this was invented in Canada, and particularly in Quebec. You put all that together, it's not as big as what China is doing. And so we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge both the opportunity that they're going to create and the competitive challenges that they're going to provide to our many, many businesses. When I look at this, all I see is a need for more of the people that you all produce, right? Educated in the world, globally sophisticated, understanding what does it mean to be a diplomat in a digital age? What does it mean to be a leader in a digital age? What does it mean to be a manager in a digital age? And that's why I think what we're doing tonight is so important. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. I will take the first question and then we'll give everyone a chance to ask some questions for the time that we have left. Eric, we have had debates about democracy and the impact of science and computing power on democracy. When you think about AI and advanced computing, how will it transform democracy over the years to come?
Well, I don't think we know yet. And I think pretty much everybody was surprised in the last 2 years by the arrival of nation-state interference in other people's election. So that would be a negative example. But at the same time, we don't credit the extraordinary access, the extraordinary reach, and the extraordinary communication that this provides for political leaders to influence the outcome. So it's traditional that everybody decries all of this, but I'm going to take the position that having our citizens more educated will ultimately produce a better democracy. That they know more, they can sort out what they care about, and that the political structure will adapt as appropriate.
Can I take some questions from the room? It's tough to look. Over there. Can you stand up, please?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So the basic question was, access to the internet is key globally to achieve any of these objectives, and I agree with that. And we forgot which year the internet no longer became optional, right? It's now fundamental. You can't operate a modern society without it. There's good news technically. There are technologies such as 5G coming along, which dramatically reduce the cost of access, increase the reach, and so forth. So I think if we put our mind to it, we can get virtually everybody connected in some form. Google has a project called Loon, which is a series of balloons that provide very good connectivity to extremely remote areas of the world. There are new, essentially very high-speed laser connections that cross mountains and things like that. In my view, almost all of the problems are now essentially political or business. In many countries, there's one PTT. In other words, it's a monopoly provider, and that usually does not provide a big incentive for speed. So the countries that have a strong president and a strong dictatorial model of making things happen, or lots of competition, tend to win. If you look at China, for example, which now has by far the largest internet, they have 3 mobile providers. They don't have one, right, for that reason.
Over there.
You spent some time discussing the relationship between technology and government from an investment standpoint and from a partnership standpoint. Historically speaking, that has led to very fruitful innovations with the creation of the World Wide Web, GPS. However, today the relationship seems to have become a bit more hostile, and I was curious as to whether you thought there was merit to that, and what you think is critical moving forward to reestablish a successful partnership between technology and government.
Technology and government. Yes. It's funny that everyone believes what you just said, but I think that relations are generally pretty good between the tech industry and governments. In particular, our products are available, right? Our customers are using them, and we can operate within reason according to our principles. Because of the impact that the tech companies are having, I'm not at all surprised that there's tensions about them, whether it's Uber and Uber displacing existing cab infrastructures and that kind of stuff, or Amazon and its distribution centers in Europe and so forth, or there's plenty of Google examples. It seems to me that each of the countries is being sort of sorted out on its attitude about that kind of competition. There are countries which are essentially whatever happens, happens, and there are others that try to shape the outcome. The thing I would say is that the reason these tech companies are doing so well is that their products are very popular. And so whatever you do, don't fundamentally slow them down. You can help modify them and so forth. But they're providing real value. They really are. And start with Google. So if people don't like Google, well, then stop using it. But you need it in order to get anything done. And by the way, last time I checked, we don't force you to use it. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Eric. I have a question. How do you inspire entrepreneurship and innovation in the younger generation in the States when one of the challenges I've heard from that group and also have witnessed firsthand is the challenge of creating patents, the cost of those patents, and then actually defending those patents versus the bigger players. And that gap seems to grow in terms of, and I've observed frustration level in some of our young. I don't know if we're relatively still, it's easier to achieve here than in China, but I'd love your observations.
Well, first place, it's much easier to do things in China because they don't follow any patent rules. In the United States, I have not found patents to be the differentiator. This is a concern, but I'll tell you that if you have a good idea, you get a team together, you can usually get the product out with or without patents. In other words, patents don't seem to be the leading problem. What seems to be true is, can you assemble a smart team around an idea fast enough? It's about speed, which is typically why these things occur in network places like Silicon Valley or Boston or New York, where you can assemble the team quickly. Why does it happen in Paris and not other great cities in France? Because they're all there. Why does it happen in London and not the other cities of UK? Because they're all there. So I think patents have not been the primary reason. Some more questions? Yes, ma'am. Give her the microphone.
You mentioned that European institutions are behind the US in some aspects, especially in funding. When you go to the US institutions, one capital campaign after the other, I mean, fundraising is tremendous. Whereas you look at Europe and all the big institutions are actually suffering from funds. Now, then you look at China, Singapore, and sort of Europe is a big hole in terms of fundraising, whereas, I mean, 200 years ago, Europe was it.
Sure.
How do you assess that the dissemination of democracy, libertarianism, and information from Europe to the rest of the world is going to happen if the universities, if the institutions, educational institutions are not funded enough that happens, whereas US now, other than federal funding even, is getting all their money from private funding. So that for me is scary coming from that part of the world. The second thing is a question that you again mentioned, the refugee crisis. US took only 27 Syrian refugees, whereas, I mean, countries like Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon took over 5 million and 11 million were displaced. What you talk about is more about a US, the 27 people in the US. I just learned it in the United Nations meeting last week. Whereas what happens to the rest of the world, that 11 million displaced people, who's going to actually take care of their jobs and their future? Maybe it's a big question, sorry.
So the first question had to do with funding. We are incredibly indebted to Europe and the history of innovation and science. That is literally why I'm here, why we're here, and New York and America should thank it. If I look at the universities today, if I look at Europe today, I see extraordinary talent without the appropriate support from their governments, from funding, and so forth. All of the ways in which companies get started, which is traditionally a professor and 2 graduate students, are almost impossible to do in European countries for one reason or another. And so I spend lots of time talking to European politicians who always bemoan the competition. And I say to them in a very polite way, you have the ability to fix this if you would fix that. And they say yes, and somebody writes it down and nothing happens. And I've been doing this long enough to think that there must be some reason why the Europeans don't want to fix this, because it's such an obvious one. And if that's not depressing enough, China has an even more aggressive funding model, where the government is directly funding not only the universities to a tune much greater than American, but they're also funding corporations to be platform leads in, for example, urban cities and urban design, surveillance, the kinds of things they care about. On the question of immigration, where to start about how foolish the United States immigration platforms are. And the simplest way to say it is, we remain a destination for the top people in the world to the United States, and yet we won't give them a visa, they go back, right? 1/4 of the students in the top programs in graduate school in America are Chinese. So I would think a fair number of them would like to stay in the United States. So we are sending them all back to China to compete with us. Now, where is the logic in this? Well, I can go on.
Maybe one last question over there.
I'm right here.
You talked about the working class earlier, and I think it's great because if you don't take care of the working class, then you get the president we have right now. So you really need to address those issues. And I think the working class is at risk today of losing a lot of jobs because of technology. You could have like millions of truck drivers without jobs, millions of Uber drivers without jobs potentially. So do you think there is enough attention on the working class? Is there someone that is doing a real honest net analysis? Technology is great, it's going to cure cancer, but how much jobs can it also destroy? And are we really taking a honest look at how much jobs we can create to offset the job loss?
Very good question. So the sum of all of the economists I know don't know the answer to your question because it's a future question and it depends on a lot of variables. My personal opinion is that there will be more jobs than qualified people to fill them, but the jobs will require more sophisticated skills. So I interpret this question as how do we take people who are doing jobs which will be lost or displaced, how do we get them to perform at a different level, right, so they can get that better job? And it seems to me that's a problem that AI can help solve, right? So I think about it as the old story in the Midwest is you had somebody who was working in a factory and then a computerized milling machine showed up and they did not have the education to operate that milling machine. So why don't we build an AI that allows that person to run the milling machine? It's not that complicated, it's something that we can do. And so that person can maintain their job. And by the way, the person running the milling machine gets a higher salary than the old job. So it seems to me that if you think of it as human plus AI, that is the worker plus the AI to make them smarter and more capable, should produce better revenue and address the question that you're describing.
Thank you, Eric, very much for your speech and
thank you all.